Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome onto the podcast Lauren Johnson to discuss her brand new book, Margaret Beaufort, Survivor, Rebel, Kingmaker. Lauren Johnson is a public historian and author of works including the critically acclaimed Shadow King, The Life and Death of Henry VI, and Margaret Beaufort, Survivor, Rebel, Kingmaker. Lauren received an MSc in Medieval Historical Research from the University of Oxford and is currently studying for an AHRC-funded collaborative doctorate with Manchester Metropolitan University and the National Archives. With a passion for restoring marginalised narratives to our history, she has worked in heritage since 2008 and has acted as historical consultant for Historic Royal Palaces, Wellcome Library, Sky History, and the Royal Shakespeare Company. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Lauren. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Excuse me, I'm just very unprofessionally downing coffee while while saying hello.
No, that's absolutely fine. I've got a big... Oh, God, my coaster stuck to it, but I've got a big mug of tea.
Yeah, dangerously undercaffeinated currently.
Today we're going to be discussing your brand new biography about Margaret Beaufort, but could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, I am. It's one of those questions like hairdressers ask you, like, "Oh, and what do you do?" And I say, I'm a historian," and then I have to explain my entire CV from the age of about 20. I trained in history. I did it at university, masters, and then I've mostly worked in public history since then. So especially in heritage, live interpretation, performance, education, in character or in costume. And then in the last 10 years, I sort of moved back because I'd been doing lots of consultancy and research and things. I moved back into the kind of research-based written stuff, I guess. And I've written 4 books now, of which this is the latest one. And this one for me is like, with no disrespect to my other book babies who are sitting behind me in their book grotto, this is the one that I've kind of wanted to write for a really, really, really long time, because women's history has always been the thing that most interested me, most fired my imagination. And I feel like Margaret Beaufort is one of the first women who went from being a sort of shadowy background figure to me. There's lots of references to My Lady the King's Mother, things like that in the Wars of the Roses. And then she actually became a sort of fully, well, at the time, not fully fleshed, but a sort of much more real human person, because so much happened to her so young. And kind of from the point that I first met her in my teens, I was like, wow, this is an incredible story. How have I not heard more about this person? And that's kind of just kept firing me ever since with a lot of the different women I've met.
What would you say is different about your books? Obviously, there's been a few biographies on Margaret.
What I tried to do in this book is to contextualize Margaret a little bit. I've spent quite a bit of time with women's history in general, but particularly women of the 15th and 16th century. And so I felt like I had a slightly different context to Margaret, because I think a lot has been written about how exceptional she is, which she absolutely is. She's a just astonishing woman. But part of the way that she is exceptional, you kind of need to see in relation to other women as well. Because actually, throughout her whole life, she was learning from other women. She was seeing what they were doing. She was interacting with them. She was maybe seeing some of the mistakes they made or some of the good choices they made and adjusting herself to that. And I think she has to be understood in that context. I don't think we can just see her as like a woman in a man's world because she wasn't. She, like, women have always been 50% of the population. She was constantly measuring herself against men and women. So I really tried in the book to kind of get a bit more of the wider world in there for her, her mother, her mother-in-law, her friends, her relatives, her servants, as far as possible. And also, I kind of feel like my history in general does something that sometimes gets a bit, what's the word? I feel it gets sometimes criticized by especially male and academic historians. But what I'm interested in is humanizing people. I am interested in the moments in their life when they might make a split second decision. And it's like, well, why do they do that? Why does Margaret Beaufort involve herself in rebellions at various points and not at others? Why does she sort of completely change her allegiances at certain points? Because she doesn't do it for no reason. She does it because of the context of her times and because of who she is. And with Margaret, just as with Henry VI, who was the topic of my last book, and Margaret of Anjou, his queen, who came up a lot when I was researching Henry, obviously, I just wanted to understand like the humanity behind them a bit more.
I mean, I think we forget that these figures in history are actually people and were people in history. Like, you just think they're so far away, you forget they are people.
Yeah, and also they change. Like Margaret lives into her 60s. I am in my 40s and I am not the same person I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, never mind 30 years ago. And Margaret was thrust onto the political scene at such a young age that of course she changed and adapted throughout her life and her experiences informed who she was. So I wanted to understand what the experiences were, how they might have impacted her, and then how that kind of gave rise to the reputation that I think she has historically, which is very much just a product of like the end of Margaret's life. I don't think the way that she is popularly remembered is the way that she was for her whole life.
When was Margaret born and what family was she born into?
Margaret is born on the 31st of May, 1443, which very handily gets written in a book of hours belonging to her family. And she comes from the Beaufort family on her father's side. And there's this amazing bit in the Book of Hours where you can see in Latin, it records Margaret's birth at the end of the month of May. And a few lines up, I think it's the 27th of May, but the following year, it records her father's death. And like, I always think of that, that if her family were looking at this book, how interconnected those events must have been in their minds. That you have Margaret, who ultimately, although her mother does get pregnant again by her father, it is ultimately the only child of her father, only legitimate child, I should say, and that she therefore inherits the claim to the throne that the Beauforts have, which is a bit of a wishy-washy claim, to be totally honest. It's questioned a few times in Parliament and by the Pope and stuff. But fundamentally, they're descended from King Edward III, and that gives them a slightly distant right to the throne. And I should say it's a right that is shared by quite a few other people who are descended from Edward III. There's the Lancastrians, Henry V, IV, VI. There's the Duke of York's family. So that's kind of very famously the Wars of the Roses, Lancaster versus York. There's also other families knocking around, the Hollands. There's other Beauforts. But the big difference with Margaret is that she is the child of the eldest son of that line. So she kind of gets that royal claim right from birth. And that's the other element as well, is that because her father dies before she's even 1 year old, she has this inheritance, like almost from before she can remember things, really. You know, it's just always there as an awareness that like there is something slightly different about her, I think is how she would have seen it.
Do, do we know much about Margaret's education? Because obviously we know she had a lot of books in her later life.
She's described by her confessor, John Fisher, as being right studious in books, and evidently she had like quite a quick aptitude for learning. Later in life, she actually translates and publishes, which is exceptionally unusual, various works. She translates them from French into English and then has them published, religious works. And she seems to have been like sort of bilingual, really, in French and English, as quite a few people were at this time because of the legacy of the Hundred Years' War between France and England. She complained that she wasn't very good at Latin, though. And that's like, it's all because of the fact that she's a girl. So people at this time are educated, like to the level they need. They're not educated beyond that. So she doesn't need Latin, technically. So she doesn't, she can just get by with a bit of church Latin and a bit of household account Latin. So I think the impression I get is that she was maybe a bit of a frustrated scholar, that she would have liked to have been educated more than she was. And like, effectively, that is all we know about Margaret, but by kind of reading across how other people operate, and especially by looking at how her mother operates, because her mother is alive into almost Margaret's 40s. And her Margaret is like, her mother is also called Margaret, as is everyone in their family. Her mother is like really astute and on it when it comes to administering estates and being on top of legal challenges and things like that. So it seems very likely that the way that Margaret effectively was educated was a very small amount of like technical learning, handwriting, reading, etc., and then a lot of just watching what her mother did, and then maybe kind of like picking up bits and pieces of how to behave and what to do from that. It's kind of like an apprenticeship, basically.
Why was she married at such a young age, and was this normal?
She was married first when she was about 6 or 7, although it's never kind of a proper marriage because she doesn't live with him. It's not consummated or anything, thank God. And then again when she's 12, and then again when she's 15, and then again when she's, does maths, 28. So, like, much married, it must be said. And the entire reason for it is her legacy from her father, that she is incredibly rich, like a millionaire in modern terms, because of the lands that she inherits from her father. And also because I think there is this kind of vague awareness that her royal title could be relevant at some point. It isn't relevant for a very long time, but it is like lying dormant. So if someone wants to wake that up, if her husband wants to be like, oh, hey guys, it looks like there's no heir to the throne at the minute. No one has any consensus. Perhaps I could step in because my wife has this claim from John of Gaunt. Then that's partly why. But yeah, it wasn't, I would say, her experience, especially of marrying at 12 and then getting pregnant extremely quickly afterwards, that is not normal. Child marriages are normal. Even living with the family of your husband, as the Duchess of York, for instance, does, that's normal. But usually you wait to consummate the marriage until you're physically ready, basically. And in fact, the average age of first marriages for most aristocratic, not marriages, excuse me, you can tell I've not had caffeine yet. The average age of first childbirth for aristocratic women at this time is 20. So Margaret is 13 when she gives birth for the first and only time. So it's extremely unusual.
Do we know much about Margaret's life after her first husband died and she's a young mother?
When she marries Edmund Tudor, she sort of quite quickly has a lot of really pivotal, transformative experiences, I think. She marries him. She's 12. She gets taken away from her family for the first time. She gets pregnant. Her husband dies. Edmund Tudor dies of the plague after having been besieged in a castle in Wales. Margaret gives birth, and then to Henry Tudor, her son is called. And then quite quickly, as far as I'm concerned, Margaret leaves that behind, sort of tries to draw a line under it, goes back to Lincolnshire where she had grown up a lot with her own family, with a new husband, and almost like starts a completely new life. And it's a bit of an uncertain time. We don't have a lot of sources for the period, like the period up until sort of the mid 1460s, to be honest, by which point Margaret has been married for nearly a decade, and it has been a mother for nearly a decade. But what was striking to me when I was looking at those sources was there wasn't a lot there about her son. There wasn't a lot of a sense of, that she was looking out for his affairs too much. There's a kind of couple of religious confraternities that she includes him in the late 1460s, and she goes to visit him in 1467. But otherwise, she's pretty much just living with her new husband, with her mother and her existing half siblings, and actually, her son is hundreds of miles away.
Can you tell us about Margaret's time at the court of Edward the Fourth?
Yeah, so Edward the Fourth is a Yorkist. And Margaret, although she has this Lancastrian claim to the throne, and although her Beaufort cousins are quite staunchly Lancastrian, she, I think, is much more ready, as were many women, I think, much more ready to sort of recognise that the Lancastrian cause seemed to be lost in the 1460s, and to submit to Edward IV and hope that she could, kind of rebuild her own status as a result. And that's exactly what she does initially. In the 1460s, she kind of works her way up to a position of not really influence or anything, but just sort of like presence, I would say, in the minds of the court of Edward IV. So in 1467, Edward IV comes on a hunting expedition and visits Margaret and her third husband, Harry Stafford, in Surrey. Then there's a really messy period, which I don't need to go into necessarily, between 1469 and 71, where there's like lots of people vying for power. Edward IV gets knocked off the throne, then he comes back, then he sort of gets knocked off again. It's extremely messy. And unfortunately, during that time, Margaret makes some calculated mistakes, as it turns out, and angers Edward IV, and also loses her husband. Harry Stafford dies during the conflict at that time. And so she kind of has to restart the whole process of ingratiating herself with the regime, which she does initially by marrying Edward IV's steward, who is called Thomas Stanley. And by marrying him and by kind of slowly moving back into court through his influence, she starts to make some more connections. But it's quite a slow process, I'd say. And it's really only like at the end of the 1470s we start to see her becoming more of a mainstay at the court, more of a constant presence. And actually, she by that point has clearly formed a bit of a relationship with the Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and she starts to be involved in lots of the court ritual that's going on. So she kind of, yeah, she works her way up twice, and then by the time Edward IV is about to die in 1483, she's actually managed to get herself in a position where her and Edward IV are making deals together for the future of Margaret's son, Henry Tudor.
I mean, I think it must, if you have Lancastrian heritage and to be in a court that was so Yorkist, it must have felt weird to be in that situation.
I think in the 1460s it didn't. I think because Edward IV was very keen on reconciling people, which he had to because so many people had been Lancastrian. He needed to do that. The big difference is after the 1469 to 71 absolute mess that had happened. After that, Edward IV behaves quite differently and really starts to clamp down on any of the Lancastrian resistance. So lots of Margaret's Beaufort cousins are killed. Henry Holland, who is actually Edward IV's brother-in-law, but who has another rival Lancastrian claim to the throne, he dies in very suspicious circumstances. Some people say he's thrown overboard from a ship. And also, very notably, Margaret feels there is enough of a threat to her son Henry Tudor because of his Lancastrian blood that she advises him to go and live in exile, which he does in 1471 and stays there basically. And it takes until about 1482, so 11 years, for Margaret to put in place a deal with Edward IV that she feels is a kind of like secure enough that Henry could come back. Unfortunately, Henry doesn't agree, so he stays in Brittany, which actually might have been for the best, given what happens again when Edward IV dies.
When Edward IV dies, the throne should have gone to his son, Edward, but things get a little bit murky, and Edward's brother, Edward IV's brother, Richard, becomes King Richard III. Why did Margaret plot against Richard when she didn't plot against Edward?
Well, she did plot against Edward
Oh.
IV. To be fair, at one point during the the previous messy period, the readeption, she did ultimately go against Edward, which is why she falls out of favour with him for a long time. But I think she is a pragmatist. And I think also most of the time she's quite willing to go along with whatever the middle way is. And I think we see that in the people she chooses to marry and a lot of her behaviour, that she is kind of willing to go with whichever regime wins. Her last husband, Thomas Stanley, her longest marriage, is like infamous for not picking sides. He just does whatever suits him. And I think it's like there's a reason she makes that marriage because there's some sort of connection there, I think, in terms of how they see political pragmatism, I think. But I think what I feel has to be understood is that I love your use of the word murky as well for 1483 when Edward IV dies, because like that's absolutely the right word. I think murky and also just like chaotic, that whole period between April 1483 when Edward IV dies, July 1483 when Richard III becomes king. Everything happens so quickly that I think a lot of people are wrong-footed by it. So I think Margaret had assumed that Edward IV's sons, who become the princes in the Tower, that they are going to be the next kings, and they're very associated with their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who Margaret has a relationship with. So I think Margaret is like, okay, well, that would be fine. That works for us. And then Richard III comes in and she's like, oh, hang on. Okay, need to completely reframe what we're doing. Richard III and Thomas Stanley have quite a combative relationship. I mean, even very recently, the year before this all happens in 1482, Stanley and Richard III, well, Richard Duke of Gloucester as he was then, go on campaign to Scotland together and have a big falling out because Stanley's left in a position that he feels is not safe by Richard. Long before that, they were having squabbles over land and things. So their relationship is not ideal. And I think Stanley has to do a bit of clever manoeuvring to sort of win his way back into Richard's favour. And my suspicion is that Margaret is sort of motivated by two things initially. One is that maybe Richard III doesn't offer them as much as she would like. So maybe he is not giving the same reassurances about Henry Tudor that Margaret needs, or maybe reassurances about other lands as well, because of course everyone is sort of out for what they can get in terms of their lands and their status and so on. But I think also Margaret sees very quickly how unpopular Richard is in certain areas. And those areas are the ones that tend to hold sway in terms of whether you can be an effective king or not. So, for instance, London has been Yorkist for like 20 years, maybe even longer, maybe 30 years. But it doesn't massively like Richard, it seems. There's quite a few little risings that happen in the summer of 1483 against Richard in London and the surrounding areas. Also, the West Country, where Margaret has lots of lands, that doesn't seem to like him too much because of various different rivalries. East Anglia is a bit uncertain. So I think she recognises, oh, okay, maybe he isn't stable. And if he's not sticking around, I don't want to be on his side too much. And also, again, just very swiftly, we move from Richard III's got the throne, everyone recalibrating. Richard III's not that popular, what do we do? Suddenly there's a big rebellion against him, led by one of his leading advisors, the Duke of Buckingham. So again, I think Margaret is just like having to react and react and react very quickly to the changing situation. And because she, I think, has a sort of natural courage and maybe a bit of a natural boldness as well at times, that when she thinks, okay, the middle way is not going to work, she just goes all in with whatever the alternative is. And I think she recognizes, okay, there's a rebellion against Richard, but there's too many different pockets of rebellion. No one seems to agree on how they're. By autumn, most people seem quite sure the princes in the Tower are dead. Whether they were or not, people think it definitely at the time. And so she's thinking, okay, maybe in that case, if there isn't anything obvious uniting these different rebels against Richard, maybe I can think of something that could unite them. because what they really need is a figurehead who can be a military commander against Richard, who can defeat him in battle, who has a claim to the throne, because you sort of need that initially to be a popular leader, who has an ability to connect the factions because he isn't known to be too in with any of them. And that basically is her son. Henry Tudor is someone who's been in exile for so long that most people don't even really know who he is. But despite his Lancastrian blood, for some time there's been the possibility he'll marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, and so unite the families. So that's pleasing to the Woodvilles, that's pleasing to Edward IV's faction. He's got lots of Welsh connections. That's going to be pleasing to the Welsh. He's got some West Country links from his mother, Lincolnshire, and so on. So that's, nice for them. And also, he's 28 almost at this point. So he is old enough that he can militarily campaign. And frankly, he's got nothing to lose because he's living in exile. He has no lands. He has no title. Like, he might as well lead a rebellion against the King of England. Why not? And so I think when Margaret recognises that, she is just like, right, that's it. That's the route I'm going to take. I'm going to make sure that my son can take the throne for himself. And unfortunately, initially in 1483, it goes absolutely terribly. The rebellion ends and Margaret ends up effectively a prisoner.
Sorry. How did she secure support when she started to approach people and go, I think my son should be the King of England?
It's really tricky. So again, we come back to the word murky. Like, these are very intelligent people who are operating in a way that they do not want to leave a trace. And we know from some of the facts of Richard III's coup that he has spies in the household of some of the leading advisors of the realm. That's what leads to William Hastings being summarily executed in the Tower in June 1483. So Margaret did this very carefully, and it can be very difficult to kind of recreate exactly how she made connections. But I think there's sort of enough evidence around to testify to the fact that she had decades-long relationships with a lot of, for instance, economic providers, so merchants, tailors, silk merchants, mercers who are connected to Calais. Lots of different people who would be providing her household in various ways, who have been working for her for years and years and years, who are all over the country as well, because Margaret's lands are all across the entire kingdom by this point. And she therefore has like trusted relationships with those people that she can call on. And I think initially part of her concern was just to get money to Henry. And it's specifically mentioned in an indictment against her in Richard III's Parliament that she has been gathering loans from people in order to fund Henry Tudor's campaigns. And I think she carries on doing that because there's just some slightly nebulous references to Henry Tudor getting big sums of money when he needs it. And it's like, I wonder where they could have come from. But also, she has a lot of awareness, I think, of the different like political alliances that are going on. We know that she approaches Elizabeth Woodville through a physician called Lewis of Caerleon. She uses him as an emissary, an in-between. A go-between is the word I was trying for there. We know that she has various other members of her household who go across to Calais and then down to Brittany and up to France. Like, she has servants effectively who are moving all around the kingdom, gathering money and also testing out people's loyalty to see who they might be willing to fight for, or even to not fight for. Because that's the other thing, is just like, if people don't turn out for Richard, that will help them. There's also been an amazing bunch of research done by Sean Cunningham of the National Archives recently, which has demonstrated how much the rebellion against Richard III depended as well on like suborning different regional officers. Like, it's really complicated and a bit dry sounding, but it's things like if you've got a load of sheriffs who are the people responsible for law in the localities, and one of them is sort of turned, so they're not doing their job properly, well, that could be undermining Richard. If they're not gathering money for the crown, again, that's going to impact Richard because he won't have enough money for his armies. If on some occasions they literally just make up names of people, they'll be like, oh yes, Tommy Giblets is the man in East Anglia. And then they call Tommy Giblets to come and give a report, and they're like, oh, Tommy Giblets doesn't exist. And loads of time is wasted trying to follow up on these things. So it's like lots of little conspiratorial ways that they are working to undermine Richard, to make him look like he's not in control, and also to stop money getting to him. And I'm absolutely convinced, especially given Margaret's different regional entourages, that she is doing this as well. But yeah, it is difficult to be like, here you go, here is the, the absolute smoking gun bit of evidence. It's just like tidbits all over the place that suggest her involvement.
Did she do a lot of this securing support while she was under house arrest from the rebellion?
Yeah, she did. That's what's very impressive. So in about January 1484, she's in Richard III's Parliament, effectively put under house arrest in the control of her husband, Thomas Stanley. And all of her estates pretty much are put in Thomas Stanley's control for his life. Now, Thomas Stanley is 10 years older than Margaret, so his life is likely to be shorter than hers. And Richard III quite promptly starts giving reversions of these lands to his supporters. So that means that Margaret definitely won't be getting them back. And I think, again, while you can completely understand why Richard III does this, because he's trying to stop Margaret getting money to Henry Tudor, I think it probably plays against him, because it means Margaret really has nothing at all to lose now. Like, with all of her estates being promised to other people under Richard, she's like, well, I might as well might as well get rid of him then. I'll carry on. So yeah, I think she absolutely is. She's sending information, and she's sending manpower, and she's especially sending money to Henry Tudor during this time, which the one thing that like she doesn't seem to have fully been able to control is her husband, which is an issue because the Stanleys have absolutely enormous armies. They've got these huge resources of manpower in the northwest of England and northern Wales. And because Thomas Stanley doesn't really want to get involved, Margaret has the difficulty of sort of trying to persuade the rest of the family to commit to Henry Tudor's rebellion with like, if he becomes king, you'll be a king's brother, you'll be a king's uncle. And quite a few of the other Stanleys and their other cousins and things do get involved in the rebellion against Richard in 1485, but Thomas Stanley doesn't for a long time. And I think that is a real concern to Margaret when we get to the time of the Battle of Bosworth.
Do we know about Margaret's involvement in the Battle of Bosworth?
Well, only in that she wasn't there. So I tried when I was writing this book to kind of to keep the lens on Margaret as much as possible. So that meant when I was talking about battles or talking about machinations going on, I was trying to see how Margaret might have been getting that information. And I found it really interesting that not only do we know that Margaret had people who become her friends, her servants, who were in both armies. So she had a number of people who were actually Richard III's servants and very loyal commanders who come over to her. And she doesn't mind that. She knows it. She thinks it's fine. And she also has people, of course, who are in Henry's army, not least Henry himself, who can provide her with information. And very intriguingly, she also gets Richard III's Book of Hours, which is his prayer book, which he appears to have like literally at Bosworth with him in his tent the night before battle. And then when Richard III is defeated in battle and killed, like basically as happens often in these situations, all of his stuff is just ransacked and taken away and given to other people. So Margaret Beaufort ends up with this book. And so I kind of, when I was describing the Battle of Bosworth, I tried to put it in the terms of like what Margaret might have known from these different sources, from this Book of Hours, from other people relating things to her. But we don't even know officially where she was. We don't know if she was in London, in Surrey, in probably, I think she was in the northwest of England on the Stanley estates at this time, kind of being made to stay out of the way by Richard III. But certainly, like, it was surprising enough that Henry Tudor won that battle and became king, that even he wasn't ready for it. There's all of these things in the household accounts that he has of like people just scurrying around trying to find some nice clothes for him to put on after battle so he can like troop down to London looking impressive. And at some point on that journey, we know that he and Margaret were reunited.
As you just said, Henry obviously wins the Battle of Bosworth. How did Margaret show her power and influence now as the king's mother?
One of the ways was by calling herself the king's mother. That was a good one. She's got a bit of a tricky situation, Margaret, because there has never been a king's mother before who doesn't kind of have a claim through her own husband, as it were. Like usually, a king's mother is someone who was a queen, who was married to a king, whose husband is dead. Margaret has never been a queen. She was never married to a king, and her husband is still alive. So she kind of has to carve out a very specific role for herself as the king's mother that hasn't really existed in the same way before. And I think she does that in part in connection with Henry and the woman that he marries, Elizabeth of York, who is a Yorkist princess in her own right, to kind of make this little trinity almost of the three of them. So Margaret is within Elizabeth's household for a long time. And some people have seen this as being kind of a bit oppressive and that Margaret's making rules and imposing herself on Elizabeth. And that is not at all how I view things, I have to say, having looked at the evidence from the time. I think initially Margaret has Elizabeth and her sister Cecily, who goes on to become one of Margaret's closest friends, living within her household because they are, they're sort of part of the defeated regime, really. So they're living with her, but very, very much being treated respectfully and elevated. And I think probably Margaret's kind of acting a chaperone so that her son and Elizabeth can get to know each other a bit before they get married. And then once they are married, Margaret is sort of present in the court. But it's really noticeable that on any kind of ritual occasions, Margaret's presence might be mentioned, but like there's nothing about how, oh, and Margaret gave a speech or Margaret does this specific thing. She's very low key, I would say, in most things. And the evidence we have for Margaret kind of stepping up and taking more of a role comes in sort of two areas of her life. One is when she actually moves out of court and goes to live at Collie Weston and kind of becomes almost like a regent for the Midlands for Henry. She's sort of running things in the Midlands for him. She's got a jail, she gets prisoners in, she's got her own courts of law, that sort of thing. And the other one is that obviously quite a long way down the line, when Elizabeth of York dies in 1503, Margaret then comes back to court and starts to create these things called ordinances, which are like court rules, one of which is very specifically for mourning clothes, so clothes for people after someone's died. So, like, again, things have sort of been read the wrong way round in the same way as the Richard III stuff. Like, Margaret responds to the situation, I would say, rather than being this driving force sort of bulldozing everyone out of her way.
I was gonna say you see a lot now, especially I guess from like the Spanish princess and the White Princess, that she kind of bulldozes her way in and she takes charge of the situation. But I think she was a bit more cautious, wasn't she? She waited to see what was happening, as she was saying.
Yeah, and also I just think there is an absolute layer of misogyny going on to the representation of Margaret over the years. And I would include in the fiction as well, actually, because there's a sort of almost a desire to pit women against each other. And it's true that people can have very difficult relationships with their in-laws, but also it's true that for lots of people, and especially in the 15th, 16th century, like your in-laws were literally your family. They were the people that you tended to live with. They were the people who would have your interests at heart. Margaret had seen Elizabeth of York grow up at court. She had spent a lot of time with that family. She had specifically been the one kind of pushing for Henry's marriage into the family from even before Richard III comes on the scene. And I think personally, when I look at the evidence of this time, that she sees Elizabeth almost as a daughter, as a child, in the same way that Henry is, but she also recognizes that both Henry and Elizabeth are superior to her in the hierarchy of the time. They are king and queen, and she is not. And like, if there's one thing Margaret Beaufort knows about, it's hierarchy. So she is not going to be stepping on their toes. And the evidence that's kind of been put forward by people over the years for her being a very difficult figure at court or for overreaching Elizabeth has been like, it has been proven to be incorrect. It comes from some ordinances that she didn't write, but which someone in the like 1700s said she did, but she didn't. And it comes from some Spanish ambassadors' reports of people who don't appear ever to have met Margaret or Elizabeth, who are just kind of repeating rumor, and also were writing with a real agenda against another Spanish ambassador who was quite close to Elizabeth. And so they wanted to make Elizabeth look powerless because then that made that ambassador look bad. So again, like you just need to look at the wider context of these things, I think. You can't just look at a source and go, oh, well, there we go. That source says that Margaret's oppressing her daughter. There we are. Like it's not that simple. You need to delve into these things a bit more and understand that women can like each other.
I mean, no, I completely agree. I just see it so much throughout history that women get pitted against each other. Like, we can't have women who are powerful that like each other. And it's not always the case, especially with Margaret Beaufort. I've seen that, like, oh yeah, she hated Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York hates her. It's like, where's the evidence for this?
Yeah. And why? Why would that be the presumption? And I think like Elizabeth of York has been presented as being totally powerless. And actually, I don't think she is. I think she's really smart. I think she recognizes, and like, again, this is a bit counterintuitive because we want women in history to be strong and to be forceful and almost sort of masculine in their behavior, masculine coded. But she isn't. She recognises that at that point in time, there have been two queens of England going back the past 40 years who have been incredibly unpopular because they appeared to be too powerful, too masculine, too in control. And so Elizabeth of York, having recognised that and seen it firsthand, let's not forget, like she's been forced into sanctuary, her brothers have disappeared, some of them have been murdered because of the activities of her mother. I think she makes a really astute decision that she is going to be a queen who is the air quotes ideal medieval queen, who basically is passive most of the time, who makes peace when they are involved in things, and whose political interactions are things that are acceptable to the political class at the time. So it's things like arranging marriages, founding religious orders, things like that. And actually, Margaret Beaufort ultimately becomes really quite more radical in the political actions that she takes later in life and the educational things that she's involved in. But I think that's because Margaret has a very different position, and Elizabeth of York is just really clever in maneuvering herself into a system that is very restraining, but that she lets herself live within those restraints for the good of herself and her family. And actually, that is in itself like very clever female queenship.
No, I agree. I think Elizabeth of York gets a really bad rap. She's always like, oh yeah, she's really boring. Like, there's nothing to go on about. It's like, no, but I think she was clever because I think she talked to Henry about political matters behind closed doors. I don't think she
Yeah, as
confronted
queens always
him.
did. Yeah, absolutely.
What was Margaret a patron of, and how did it reflect her as a person?
Margaret is I mean, she's a patron of a lot of stuff. But it kind of falls under religious things and educational things. The major kind of legacies really that Margaret leaves as a patron are two Cambridge colleges, St John's and Christ College, and also she founds a school at Wimborne Minster where her parents are buried, a chantry school. And she also is a major patron of printing presses, of religious works that are printed. And very unusually, as I said earlier, she herself has works published that she has written, translated, but you know, she is the person who has done that translation. And then she ensures that they are printed, she ensures they are bound and turned into proper books and they are disseminated. And one of the things that really surprised me when I was investigating Margaret's later life was the degree of obviously this is a medieval version of egalitarianism, but the measure of egalitarianism in her thinking when it came to access to certain types of learning. So the fact that she wanted people to have religious learning in their hands and to have access to it in a way that she had not been able to, I thought was actually really radical and revolutionary. because she was promoting preaching in English rather than Latin, which was the language of the church, which meant people could understand it. In her Cambridge Foundation, she specifies that she wants a set number of the people working there and the student body to be from the northern counties because she recognises that they tend to have less access to education and to wealth. She also has her books printed in English, some of them, that though they are translated works from Latin, and even using the printing presses themselves. That is new technology at this point. It's only been around since the mid 15th century. And printed books were so much more accessible than what had gone before, because what had gone before was manuscript copies that had been handwritten on vellum and put in someone's library where only certain people could go and read it, Margaret being one of them. So the fact that she recognised her own privilege and worked to ensure that some of that privilege was disseminated to others, I found like really extraordinary for her time. And again, like it doesn't look like feminism or socialism or anything like that, a 21st century idea of these things. But it is, when you compare it to 15th century behaviours, like very forward thinking.
I mean, I never knew that. I think that's absolutely incredible, especially when you think in her grandson's reign, he doesn't want stuff translated into English.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think she would have given Henry VIII a slap in the head at a certain point, as would I.
What is Margaret's legacy and what should she be remembered for?
That's such a good question. I mean, her legacy is those Cambridge colleges, and I think also other colleges and schools use her name because of that association. So I think that is a major one. I think the Tudors are a pretty big legacy. I do not think that they would have got the throne or stayed on it without Margaret there. I think she was fundamental to Henry VII becoming king, and then to helping him understand how to maneuver a situation where, he's a king who comes into England having not lived there for pretty much his whole life. So, I mean, really extraordinary. And yet he manages to make bonds with people. And obviously that is partly testament to him, but I do think Margaret is very much involved in that. And I think the other legacy, this is one of my favourite facts about Margaret. So she is the first English woman to appear in print in 1504. Her translations are the first time an English woman is printed. And that's pretty mega. And I think she should be remembered as a courageous individual who was willing to take risks, but who also was pragmatic, who also recognized that the reality of how messy life is. And again, that was a surprise to me, because I think if you've seen a picture of Margaret, she looks like a really dour-faced old grumpy nun. And that's probably what she looked like in real life too. But she also, in her household, she was welcoming people who had really complicated personal lives, who were having affairs, who had illegitimate children, who were fleeing unhappy marriages or abuse. She looked after people when they were sick. She knew the names of most of her servants, even though there were 400 of them, according to one of her servants. So, the biggest thing I felt when I was researching her was that she was someone I liked. And I liked her because she had a measure of humanity and practicality almost that was quite unusual for her time. And I think we should remember her not as this kind of dragon lady, horrible old bat intervening in everything. Like, we should remember her as someone who overcame incredible challenges in her life, and had a monumental impact on British history.
I think that's really well said because I've learned actually so much today about Margaret, more than I thought I didn't know.
There's loads that, yeah. And there's so much I also couldn't put in the book, of course.
Book two, more about Margaret.
Yes, Margaret Beaufort, the Beauforting. I don't know.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a historical pet peeve?
Oh, well, obviously one of them is that Margaret is awful and that she killed the princes in the tower, which is absolute nonsense, but comes up quite often. Like, no way. No way. Didn't happen.
It is actually ridiculous how much I'm seeing that on social media.
Yeah, it is nonsense. And like even the most rudimentary engagement with sources shows that it's not the case.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
God, I'm going to be so boring because I'm going to say Margaret again, but I genuinely would like to have met her. And Jane Austen would be another one. Like essentially, people in women. I mean, it would be women. I wouldn't bother inviting any men. It would be women in history who were clever, who were quite witty. And Margaret was, she had. That's the other thing. She had a sense of humour. She was quite funny. I think that would be enjoyable. Um, I think her and Catherine Parr would get on quite well as well. Henry VIII's sixth queen, another published lady, incidentally. Eleanor of Aquitaine, she'd be good. We could all have a little argument about who's the rightful queen or whatever. And maybe Mary Wortley Montagu. I'm quite keen on her. The 18th century pioneer of vivisection.
I mean, that'd be quite a good dinner table, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it is quite a rich dinner table. Um, so who could I have who is actually working class apart from me? Uh, I'd just be serving them. I'd be scum in the corner, is what I'd be. I wouldn't be allowed to eat with them. There's someone called, oh, in fact, there's a couple. There's someone called Catherine Lefebvre, who was a blacksmith at the Tower of London in the 14th century. And I'd be very interested to know what she was actually doing, what
Hmm.
her job consisted of, and if there were other, because there seem to have been other women blacksmiths and other women in jobs that we might not think. It'd be really interesting to know about that.
Have you got a favourite book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
One of my favorites is Matrix by Lauren Groff, which is, I read it a few years ago, and it's one of those where I really didn't have any idea what it was going to be about. I saw that it was around the life of someone called Marie de France, who again would be a good dinner party guest, who wrote, oh, Christine de Pizan I should have put in my dinner party too. So it's just all intellectual women. Um, Marie de France was a 12th century writer and possibly abbess as well. And this book kind of goes through her life in a sort of occasionally sort of mystical way. But what I loved about it, and it's the only book I've ever read this in, was that because it was so completely through a female narration, and because it was a woman who lived with other women in a monastery most of the time, all of the male characters who appear in it are perceived sort of through that lens. They are perceived through a connection to a woman rather than, that they are the archetype, they are the norm. And I loved that. I loved that it just completely flipped how it presented male and female dynamics because actually that would be another of my pet peeves is it maddens me when women are defined by their relationships to men rather than in themselves. It's partly why I chose the book title I did, because I do not like it when people, it's Margaret Beaufort, King's mother. It's like, well, she was also a load of other things as well. Should we use some non-gendered terms? Should we use some things that define her in her own right? And like, yeah, those words don't have to have a male gender as the norm. So yeah, that would be a book that I would recommend to almost anyone.
If you could go back in time to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
I mean, it's probably going to be 1485, isn't it? It's a bit boring, but I mean, it genuinely, even before I wrote this book, it would have been. Uh, Maybe Bosworth itself might be quite interesting to see. If I could be guaranteed safety, I would be quite interested in seeing a medieval battle. I mean, it would be awful, obviously, but I don't really understand how they worked. I find it quite mind-boggling. And yeah, I would love to see Henry VII. I'd be interested to see Richard III. Mainly, I would want to see Margaret Beaufort. But yeah, I think probably it would be Battle of Bosworth.
And finally, have you got a favourite historical fact?
Well, I've already kind of used it because it was Margaret Beaufort being the first English woman to appear in print, which I really like. Catherine Parr's the first published Queen of England. I think that's a fun fact. I think the biggest thing is just like women were there. Women have always been 50% of the population. It's not necessarily a historical fact, but I feel like it's a fact that gets forgotten a lot of the time when we're talking about women in the past. We sort of, yeah, we just assume they're all sitting in a corner sewing or something. And actually, no, they were all, doing stuff all the time. They were just doing it out of sight a lot of the time.
Thank you so much for coming on today, and I think you've taught everyone new things about Margaret.
I hope so. Yes.
Thank you for listening to her story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.